Ukraine isn't just fighting Russia. They're using Russia's own weapons to humiliate them. The same tanks and ammunition Putin sent to crush Ukraine are now being used to crush his forces. It's almost too perfect. Russia's prized war machines left behind in retreat, only to be turned against them by the very people they set out to defeat. While Putin's troops struggle, Ukraine has scavenged abandoned Russian tanks, artillery and ammo, turning Russia's own tools of war into weapons of their own destruction. The ultimate irony: Ukraine is proving Russia's so-called superior weapons are better in Ukrainian hands. But how did this come to be? And what's even more surprising, this isn't just a stroke of luck for Ukraine. There's a deeper story behind how they've turned Russia's own arsenal against them, one that involves clever tactics and unexpected opportunities. It all starts with Ukraine's Soviet military legacy. But that's just the beginning. Here's what we mean. At the start of the war, Ukraine had to rely predominantly on its own military supplies, and those came from Russia itself, or rather, the Soviet Union. As a former Soviet country, Ukraine inherited most of its military systems, weapons, and even tactics from the Union upon its dissolution in 1991. Another excellent and more recent example is the fact that both countries use Soviet-era tanks. On Ukraine's side, those are the T-64s and T-72s, and the more modernized T-80s. All of these tanks were leftovers from the Soviet Union, but the Ukrainians have also managed to pull these tanks from beyond their domestic supply. Other Eastern European countries, such as Poland and the Czech Republic, have donated over 340 T-72s and their modified versions to Ukraine. Additionally, the Netherlands and Denmark have donated over 80 T-72s, split between old models taken out of storage and overhauled to make them combat-worthy, and versions updated to include better electronics. It's estimated that Ukraine has roughly 520 T-72s. Of course, NATO countries have donated more modern equipment like the Abrams, Challenger, and Leopard tanks. So why is there so much focus on supplying various versions of Soviet-era T-72s? Simply put, the Ukrainian military has, in practice, only ever possessed these types of tanks, so its troops have long been trained to operate Soviet-born systems rather than their Western equivalents. Furthermore, Western tanks and T-types have quite a big overlap in offensive power, but the exact ammunition they use is typically different. This means that Ukraine has two different problems to solve. First, the country has been using its own tanks and ammunition. If it starts running out of either, it would need to find a supplier, since its domestic production only covers ammunition for the vehicles that existed in its military before the war started. And while Ukraine was a massive arms exporter throughout the 2010s, it's currently using ammunition at a far greater rate than it can produce. The second problem is that the country doesn't make ammunition for the Western vehicles and systems. It's entirely reliant on NATO countries, such as the US or the UK, to supply the relevant ammo for these donated systems. The US has also scoured other countries for supplies of Soviet-era ammunition and promptly sent whatever it could get to Ukraine. Most of these countries received their ammunition from the Soviet Union, Russia, or even Ukraine over the previous decades. In a sense, that ammo is now coming back to Russia by being shot at Russian soldiers and tanks. But the more interesting part about Ukraine's Russian weapons is that Ukraine is also fielding T-90s. The T-90 is a wholly Russian-made tank, with the T-90M being the latest update to the T-72 tank design. These tanks are entirely produced by Russia and have not been exported to Ukraine at all. The T-90M, in theory, has similar offensive capabilities to an M1 Abrams, but lacks the maneuverability and has some critical defensive failures that anti-tank missiles can exploit. This main battle tank is primarily operated by Russia and fielded by less than a dozen countries, mostly allied with or in trade relations with Russia. Naturally, none of these countries have supplied their own T-90s to Ukraine for the war. But despite that, Ukraine has managed to get a hold of a few pieces anyway. How? The answer is simple. Russia itself donated the tanks, in a way, to Ukraine as a result of their failed invasion offensives. For most of 2024, Russia failed to make a significant impact on the Eastern Front in the Donbas region of Ukraine. As the front lines and borders have shifted during the course of battle, the Ukrainian military has frequently forced Russian troops to abandon makeshift posts. Sometimes these soldiers would be captured or forced to flee, leaving their vehicles behind. As a result, according to some reports, Russia has lost over 100 of what Putin boldly claims are the best tanks in the world to Ukraine over the course of the war. But not all of the vehicles were destroyed. In mid-2024, images online showed the Ukrainian army fielding a T-90M that had been salvaged in relatively good condition from the battlefield. Russia itself doesn't have a tank that's performed better than the T-90M yet. The T-90 was supposed to be superseded by the T-14 Armata, a more modern and highly reinforced main battle tank. However, only a dozen or so of the Armatas have been produced, and they've been shunted off the battlefield mere weeks after having been deployed. In fact, it could be argued that the best tanks on the Russian side have been the obsoleted T-72s and even T-64s, since Russia has thousands of these tanks in storage, and they have been as relevant as more modern armor in the grand scheme of the war. But getting back to the T-90, Ukraine acquiring these tanks, and from Russia no less, is extremely important for its military. The reason lies in the aforementioned training and availability of domestically produced ammo. Since the T-90 is based on the T-72, which the Ukrainian troops are far more familiar with, the newer tank can be used pretty much from the get-go. Additionally, the tanks actually use the same main 2A46M 125mm smoothbore guns, meaning that Ukraine should have plenty of ammunition for the more modern tanks to go around. What's more, it's not just the tanks that Ukraine has been salvaging from successful operations. Whenever the Ukrainian military captures a Russian outpost or supply lines, there's bound to be some ammunition or ordnance that the Russian military has left behind. All ammunition that isn't directly compatible with the weapons and systems that Ukraine is using at the time is also salvaged and put to good use. The ammo gets sent back to specialized ammunition bunkers, where technicians read the technical information regarding each piece. Then pretty much every piece of ammo either gets disassembled to its base components or reused for other projects. One example of reusing the Russian ordnance, especially anti-tank mines or missiles, comes in the form of arming commercial drones. Drone warfare has been particularly devastating for both sides. These are not the large and expensive Seeker drones that the US has used throughout its war on terror, such as the MQ-9 Reaper. Both Ukraine and Russia do have military-grade recon and hunter drones on a similar, albeit smaller scale, like the Turkish TB2 Bayraktar, or a few domestic innovations. However, the bulk of the so-called drone army is made up of drones that you might normally see used for photography and video making. These drones, typically hailing from China in one way or another, are incredibly cheap to make or source, often costing as little as a few $100s. Compare that to the price tag of military-grade drones, which can be measured in the millions. Then the Ukrainian engineers take the recommissioned ammunition that the Russians left behind and attach it to the small drones. This effectively makes each drone a maneuverable, remote-controlled kamikaze drone. Although these models don't quite have the range to compete with the behemoths of the industry, they have proven to be effective. A drone can typically fly for 10 to 15 miles, with the operator hidden from view and detection. In some cases, the drone carries an anti-tank mine. In others, it's an anti-personnel bomb. But either way, the drones are tasked with one simple mission: find and destroy a Russian fortification or tank. And that's exactly where the tank differences come into play. For all the advancements that the T-90 has introduced, it still has a vital flaw that these drones can abuse. The ammunition loading system inside the tank is automated, unlike in Western tanks. The spare ammunition is stored below the turret, and the casing for the storage is covered by a relatively thin protective layer. If shot from a precise angle below or above the tank, an explosive round can detonate the ammunition, creating a shockwave that goes up into the main tank compartment. The phenomenon has been dubbed explosive decapitation, as the main tank turret typically launches off the tank's body from the pressure of the explosion. In contrast, Western tanks typically have a crew member manually loading the ammunition, which is usually stored closer to the turret. In the case of the Abrams, for example, the ammunition is stored in a special hub attached to the turret, with a blast door that opens outward if the stockpile is hit. This redistributes the shock of the blast and minimizes the risk of the entire tank blowing up alongside the ammo. The small size of the commercial drones allows them to maneuver around and into the exact positions needed to seriously damage the Russian tanks. Additionally, with such a low production cost, and the fact that Ukraine can reuse ammunition that is left behind by the Russians, the economics of the war are working against Russia, which would normally have a much larger military budget and ammo stockpile to use. The maths is relatively simple, at least according to the Achilles Battalion of the 92nd Brigade. In its report for April 2024, it estimated that running the battalion and maintaining the drone equipment costs roughly $15 million per month, with the caveat that the battalion was estimated to be roughly half full at the time. The report claims that during April 2024, the battalion was responsible for roughly $100 million in damage to the Russian military, whether directly to troops or to vehicles and infrastructure. The sheer difference in losses inflicted on Russia by a single battalion showcases the severe operational and organizational advancements that Ukraine has had to undergo in order to eke out advantages over the course of the war. The primary method of using these drones has been nocturnal, staggered attacks. Because drones are barely perceptible on thermal and night vision cameras, they can practically sneak up on the enemy and launch devastating precision attacks to take out vital ammunition stockpiles or vehicles. In some cases, the target is even a particular person, usually an enemy drone operator. Since both sides have developed similar tactics with commercial drones, and both are being supplied either directly or indirectly by China, Ukraine and Russia are both starved for trained drone operators for their military. Typically, these operators come from backgrounds that involve commercial drones for hobbyist purposes such as races or photography. A few years into the war, and they've become indispensable resources for each country's military. One such vital mission was in early January 2024, when Ukrainian operators managed to find and kill the famous Russian drone operator Moisey, who had been credited with striking over 31 boats and killing close to 400 soldiers. Ultimately, the drone battalions used replaceable parts, with the drones and reused ordnance sourced either directly from their own supplies or found in abandoned enemy fortifications. But the men who operate these drones are much more valuable to both sides of the conflict than the equipment, and Russia is perhaps running out of men faster than it can replace them. According to the most recent statistics, the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense estimates that Russia has lost over 670,000 soldiers throughout the war. Considering that reports from the Russian Ministry of Defense suggest that the military signs around 400,000 new military contracts per year, excluding conscripts who can't be deployed to the front line, it's likely that the Russian military is using up its experienced personnel. Alternatively, the waves of soldiers that Russia is throwing onto the front lines are being replaced relatively quickly by new ones, a situation which is amassing even more losses, as these soldiers are unlikely to be experienced enough for a war of this scale. Some Western strategists have gone so far as to suggest that Russia will lose 1 million soldiers by early 2025, implying that the rate at which its soldiers are dying or being critically wounded will only increase. Each fallen Russian soldier in Ukraine can also potentially leave their ammunition and ordnance behind and unfired. This would mean that if Russia starts losing soldiers faster, it would also essentially start providing the Ukrainian military with more weapons and equipment. And with the lopsided cost-to-effect ratio of what a single Ukrainian drone battalion can achieve, the future of the war in Ukraine seems relatively simple, yet bleak for both sides. Drones will keep being sent to the front lines to perform precision strikes, while soldiers are relegated to scavenger and retrieval duty to fuel the battalions further. One of the kinks in that plan might lie in Russia's access to mid to long-range artillery. The main way that Russia has managed to press home its numerical advantage over Ukraine so far has been through its larger stockpiles of artillery, both towed and untowed. To accentuate the point, consider a report that suggests that Russia produces roughly 3 million rounds of artillery ammunition per year. The 32 members of NATO, on the other hand, have only been able to send roughly 1.2 million rounds to Ukraine per year without using up their own ammunition supplies. Despite the Ukrainian Defense Ministry claiming that Russia has lost close to 20,000 artillery systems, there doesn't seem to be a lack of them on the battlefield. This is particularly dangerous when you account for the fact that Russia has arguably some of the most advanced artillery systems in the world. Take the Tu-S19 for example, as the modernized version of the Soviet-era Tu-S3 artillery, which is used by both Ukraine and Russia. Some models have been designed to reach a fire rate of roughly 9 to 10 rounds per minute. Compare that to Western artillery vehicles, which typically fire between 1 and 4 rounds in that time. Furthermore, this artillery can be supported by old Soviet-era towed pieces, creating a border that Ukrainians can't cross lest they are shelled to oblivion. The presence of artillery is one of the few ways that Russia has managed to evade being completely annihilated by Ukrainian kamikaze drones. The drones typically have a range of around 15 miles, while even shorter-range artillery has a range of at least 20 to 30 miles. Nevertheless, the Ukrainians are fighting with artillery themselves, as mentioned earlier, and even that artillery has been partially supplied by Russia. One such example is an ancient World War II towed artillery gun. Initially built by the Soviet Union, the gun was deployed to fight against Nazi Germany in 1944. 80 years later, it's found its way out of the stockpiles that the Soviet Union left to Ukraine. Ironically, it's Germany that's been responsible for donating vital ammunition that these guns can use. The Ukrainian tactic for using artillery ties into how the military has been using drones. Mid-range artillery strikes damage or decentralize enemy positions. Drones are used for reconnaissance or taking out enemy drone operators, and then the rest of the army can swoop in to claim the prize: more ammunition and weapons. The process itself is circular. Ukraine has also recently started being more aggressive with its long-range missile strikes, targeting vital supply lines behind the front itself, thereby preventing Russia from reinforcing its troops with fresh ammo. When you combine all these factors, Ukraine has pretty much perfected the art of modern attritional warfare, mechanizing and streamlining the process to use as little manpower and Western arms as possible. But that doesn't mean Ukraine doesn't need all the help it can get. Western donations are vital in preventing Russia from overwhelming Ukraine from the air or using its own missiles to strike deep into the country. And through all that, Ukraine has mustered a morale-boosting invasion of its own. The August 2024 invasion of the Kursk region showed just how well organized the Ukrainian army is compared to Russia's. The Kremlin's response to the invasion in Kursk has been staggered, and was delayed by a few weeks, allowing Ukraine to occupy practically the same amount of territory as lost in Donbass over the previous 7 months. The fact that one of Russia's so-called red lines has been crossed, Russian territory being invaded in this case, and its military's difficulties in mounting a significant counter has led to the widespread belief in the West that the Russian army is less willing to fight Putin's wars than ever before. Adding to that is a successful drone attack on the Russian capital of Moscow just a month later, which shows that Russia's layered anti-air defenses are not as impenetrable as they seemed at first. The invasion of Kursk and threat of the Ukrainian army mounting further meaningful offensives suggests that the drone warfare taking place on the Eastern Front is working. It's believed that Russia is losing more soldiers, weapons, and ammunition than ever. Its capital is now in Ukrainian sights for missile attacks. NATO members are discussing whether it's time for their donations of long-range artillery to be used to launch offensive strikes inside Russia. All of these factors combined could be enough to give the Ukrainian military a real chance to not only repel Russia, but be able to win the war and make meaningful demands at the peace negotiations that follow. And that's been in no small part due to Ukrainian ingenuity in repurposing and putting to good use the ammunition and ordnance salvaged from Russians abandoning their posts. But what do you think? How long will the war in Ukraine last? Let us know in the comments, and thank you for watching. Now go and check out how Ukraine's paper planes are destroying Russia's military, or click this other video instead.